Hi, it's Stu from HiveMind Automation and welcome to the Hive. In this video we're going to be taking a look at the Home Assistant user interface. So grab your computer and let's dive in. In the first video of the Getting Started series, I showed you how to install Home Assistant on a Raspberry Pi using Balena Etcher and perform the initial setup of Home Assistant on your Raspberry Pi. If you haven't checked out that video yet, click the link in the description or here on screen to check it out. In this video, we're going to explore the Home Assistant user interface a little bit, and if we're feeling adventurous while we're at it, we might even make a few tweaks to our configuration. Let's dive into the user interface by navigating to the IP address of our Raspberry Pi on port 8123. So :8123 at the end there, that's important. And we'll hit return. Now that we've got the interface in front of us, let's explore. The most obvious place to start is in the top left-hand corner here where we've got the Home Assistant title row and then things like overview, map, logbook, history. We'll look at these individually. Just to the left of this Home Assistant title bar, we've got this exposure hamburger stack, if you like, and we can click on that and that opens or closes that sidebar. If you collapse that, I like to call that Pro mode. I find that that looks a little bit nicer, especially when you've got quite a lot happening on your dashboard. And I'll show you what my production server looks like. For now, we'll just expand that again. So the overview is your default dashboard. If we click on Map, we've got access to a map here and we'll see that we've got our Home Assistant where we set it up as being in the initial setup phase. We can also add additional zones here. Now, zones are a concept that we use for presence detection, and presence detection comes into play when we talk about automations. If we click on this edit button here, we see that we've got this default one, but we can add another zone here. So if I click the plus button and let me zoom out, and I'm just going to move over, I'm going to plonk one here in East Melbourne. If you happen to know the full latitude and longitude of the location that you want to add, by all means type it in here. We might talk in another video about finding the latitude and longitude using Google Maps or something like that. And we'll give this a name, we'll call this East Melbourne zone. And we can change the radius of our zone as well. So if I want the radius to be 1,000 meters, so it's within 1 kilometer of that location, then we can do that. When we've got a big enough radius compared to the zoom level of the map, we can click and drag this circle to kind of get the size that we want. You know what, I like 400 meters. Great. So we've created the East Melbourne zone and we can keep doing that. You can do things like change it to, if we head back over here, we can change the icon. Let's change this to MDI office building. And that's now changed it to an office building. And we can click on update there. The reason we might want to set up different zones is so that we can then use presence detection to trigger automations. For example, if I have Home Assistant on my mobile phone and Home Assistant knows when my mobile phone leaves my East Melbourne office zone, for example, to head home to this Melbourne CBD zone, we could use that state change as we leave the East Melbourne zone as a trigger in an automation to then say, turn the heater on at home, for example. We'll take a closer look at some of those things in a more detailed automations video later on. Here in the top row here, we've also got persons, and we can define each person of interest in Home Assistant, and that's a little bit more to do with the configuration tab. You'll see it's highlighted there, and we've also got users, and that's all about user accounts within Home Assistant. If we go back to zones, we're back to the map again. We've also got this logbook menu item on the left, and as the name suggests, it shows us recent events in Home Assistant. On the logbook page, you'll see that we can use this drop down to filter by entity, and an entity is simply something that Home Assistant knows about. Whether it's an accessory, whether it's a tracked state of a sensor, whether it is a light, those entities exist in Home Assistant, and they're things that can either be acted upon or trigger actions. For example, we can click on the sun.sun entity, and that, if we were to have any logs in the logbook, we would then be able to filter by that. You don't have to filter, you can just leave it as is. You can also filter by date range. So if we click on this start date, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select, let's go from the 28th to the 1st and select. So now you'll see that we've filtered this date range between the 28th of August and the 1st of September. Now that we've filtered that, we've got a couple of different things showing up in the logs. You'll see, for example, at 3 o'clock on the 28th, Home Assistant started, and then pretty much everything that happens from that point. Things like now the first instance here shows that the sun had risen at 3:27 in the afternoon. Obviously, that's not right, but that was the first that Home Assistant knew about the sun being in existence. And then at 6 o'clock the sun set. Sun rose at 6:45 and then set again at 6 o'clock the next day and rose again at 6:43 today. So we can see any actions that have occurred, any history here. The history tab is very similar, however it shows it in a different graphed manner. And again, this is filtered by date. So if I change this date range, and we'll go again from the 28th, you'll see we've got different color codes and different states. So if we look at the sun, for example, we've got above horizon, below horizon, above horizon, below horizon, etc. This can get quite full when you start adding a lot more entities. So we'll take a look at that when we've got some more information. So now that we've looked at the main 4 items that we've got here, we'll actually take a look at some of the more interesting things down the bottom left-hand corner here. Obviously, this is probably less frequently used, but also the more powerful section. So the bottom left section is more about your settings. We've got things like developer tools, we've got the supervisor, configuration, notifications, and our username. Firstly, let's look at developer tools. Inside the developer tools page, we've got states, services, template, and events, those different tabs there. In the states, we can set the representation of a device within Home Assistant. And then we've got a list of our entities, current entities here, and we can filter those based on different things. So if we wanted to filter our entities by the entity name, I could start typing weather, and we've got some information here, and we can see the current state and the current attributes of that particular entity. Current wind speed, humidity, etc. We can see all sorts of useful information there. And that can sometimes be useful if we're testing different things. If we click on the Services tab, we can actually, it says right here, the Service Dev tool allows you to call any available service in Home Assistant. And if we click on the drop down, we can see different services that we have access to. Things like Home Assistant Stop, Home Assistant Turn Off, Turn On, etc., etc. Services can be thought of as functions or subprograms. They can do things like turn devices on or off, push a notification to device, and even reload components of Home Assistant and restart Home Assistant after you've made changes to the configuration. One example of a service would be notify.notify, and we can create notify.notify, and it's got a parameter and a description, and we can actually then fill example data. When we do this, we see an example in the YAML of what we can do. So we can do message, the garage door has been open for 10 minutes. The title can be whatever we want it to be. We can specify a target, and we'll take a look at that when we actually dig deeper into this. And there's also a data section there. we're not going to worry about that just yet. We'll actually look at that in a later video. We've got this template tab here, and the template tab allows us to test templating for Home Assistant. So we've got an example already loaded here in the screen, and this is on every instance of Home Assistant by default. And you'll see that we're declaring some variables. So we're declaring that the temperature is 25 and the unit is degrees Celsius. And we've got some test text here, which is the temperature is, and then we're inserting the variables. We've also got an if-else statement here, which does a couple of different things. And we've also got a for loop example here as well. This example text then outputs this over here. So whatever code we've written inside this box here changes the output over on the left. So for example, if we take a look at this row here, row 7, the temperature is, and then it's taking the mytest.json and the temperature and then the unit, and then injecting them in to go, the temperature is 25 degrees C. I could change anything here, and you'll notice that it changes over here. We could also change the unit, and we see that the templating changes, and we can even change the templated text. The outside temperature is. So all this is doing is really testing templating. Now, templating comes into play a little bit later on when we start talking about automations and using notifications within automations. For example, we can take the temperature that's being reported by a sensor and then pop that into a notification to then push that notification to a mobile phone that has the Home Assistant app installed on it. We'll take a closer look at that, as I say, in another video. We're going to go to events now. And if we take a look at the documentation by clicking here, it says the core of Home Assistant is the event bus. The event bus allows any integration to fire or listen for events, and it's the core of everything. So let's take a look here, and we'll see that we've got available events for things like state changed, and we've got some listeners listed here. So we can fire an event on the event bus, and we've got the event data YAML, and it's optional. So you probably won't use this very much. It's worth knowing that it's here if you wanted to, and that the documentation is available here. We'll take a closer look at events in another video. We'll have a look at Supervisor. Now, Supervisor is actually a much more useful tab for you. The Supervisor tab allows us to do some things. So this dashboard straight away, there's not a whole lot going on here right now, but you'll see we've got this list add-ons here. When we add some add-ons, which we'll do in just a moment, those add-ons will start appearing down here, and the state of those will show here. Another thing that shows up on this dashboard page, we'll see that there are any updates that are available for Home Assistant will show up on here. So when a release comes out, probably within a week or two, we'll actually see another update available here. If we click on the add-on store tab, now that we can see that there's actually some useful things in here. And I would recommend that you install a couple of different things in here. We've got official add-ons and Home Assistant community add-ons. A couple of things that I would recommend you install is a Samba share. So we will install that. And a Samba share allows us to access the file system over the network of our Raspberry Pi. So that's going to quickly install, and we won't start that just yet, but we'll pop back out. So we see that we've got that in the add-ons list, and it's decolored because it is not currently running. Another thing I would recommend adding is a file editor. And in fact, we'll use the file editor a little later on. That actually allows us to use the web interface to directly modify the configuration files of Home Assistant. So we'll install that. We'll actually click Show in Sidebar, and we'll start that. Because we've got Show in Sidebar, we'll see that we've got File Editor over in the left side here. And now that we've got that running, you'll also see that the icon for that is not desaturated. So we've installed Samba Share and File Editor. So we've also got a search here in the top left corner. So if we were looking for something in particular, we could start typing the name if we know about it. So if I wanted to start typing Sonos. It seems that the additional add-on that I was looking for doesn't exist in either the Home Assistant Community add-ons or the official add-ons. And if we click on the ellipsis here, you can see that there's this repositories. And so if we wanted to add a repository in here, we could grab the address of that, type that in there, and then click add, and that will add another repository in this list. We'll take a look at that in a later video, which we'll actually talk about expanding Home Assistant and adding on to its current capabilities. For now, we'll move on to the Snapshots tab, and this Snapshot tab is super useful, especially when you're getting started. What you can do with the Snapshots tab is Snapshots allow you to easily back up and restore all of your data of your Home Assistant instance. So we've just gotten started. We've not really done much with this particular Home Assistant instance. So what I'm going to do is create a full snapshot and call it starting point, and we'll hit create. So that's taken a full snapshot 0 seconds ago. You can do a partial snapshot as well and do things like only take backups of specific things. And you can also put a password on your snapshot. The great thing about taking a snapshot is it means that we can then very quickly and very easily restore back to that snapshot if we break something in Home Assistant. So taking a starting point snapshot, I would highly recommend that. We'll look at restoring snapshots in another video. And the last tab up here is the System tab. So we've got some system information here, things like the supervisor and the host system. The supervisor is essentially what keeps Home Assistant up to date and running, and allows us to do certain things within Home Assistant to keep it up to date without then having to drop into a Linux shell. We've got some things here like the version of the supervisor that we're running, and it shows the current version and the latest version. And there's also an option to join a beta channel here. We're not going to do that now. Obviously, you might find that if you are running a beta channel, you might have some stability issues. There's also share diagnostics, and we can turn that on if we want, and that's going to share crash reports and other diagnostic information with the development team. And if you're interested in learning more about that, you can hit learn more. Reload will reload the supervisor, and we mentioned join beta channel before. Host system. So this is information about the host that we're running on. So the Raspberry Pi, we've got the host name is Home Assistant. The system is HasOS 4.12, and that's the image that we flashed to the SD card in the last video. And the deployment we've got here is production. We can click on this hardware button and we'll see some information about the hardware that's plugged into it. We've also got change host name, so if we wanted to, we could change that to a new host name. If we wanted to, we could call it Skynet or something like that. We can also reboot, shut down, or import from USB. Now, import from USB is about loading HasOS configs or updates from a USB that we've plugged into that device. We've also got the system log here, so we'll actually see different color codes in here. Things like green is generally recommended. Green is probably a good thing. White is a fairly kind of neutral thing. And if you see anything red in here, it's probably something that you need to take a closer look at. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, you've also got refresh, so you can actually see the latest information in here. We even see information about the snapshot that we just took on the Raspberry Pi as well. Back over on the left, I'm going to skip past the configuration and come back to that near the end because there's actually quite a lot to take a look at in there. Skip past that and we'll have a look at notifications. Now we've got a notification already telling us that we've discovered new devices on the network and we can check it out. We'll take a look at that when we look at integrations in the configuration in a moment. But you can see that we've got this persistent notification, and we can dismiss it because it is a persistent notification until we dismiss it. What we can also do is add things like we might see security alerts, such as a repeated failed login attempt from a particular IP address. And we can also do things like have automations call that notify service that we looked at before to place a notification in this notification center. We'll dismiss that for now. If we click our name here in the bottom left, we've got some user settings that we can change. For example, we've got the language. You need to install certain language packs for this to work, but we can change the language. We can change the theme. So at the moment we've got either auto, we can change it to light theme, or we can change it to dark theme. We can also do things like changing the primary color and the accent color on there. Dashboard. So for this particular device, we can choose a default dashboard. So if we had more than one dashboard, and we'll talk about having more than one dashboard a little later on, we can choose the default dashboard that loads on this particular device. We can choose to either always hide the sidebar or not. We can enable or disable vibration on this device when controlling devices. That's probably more relevant for mobile phones. Push notifications, and that does require SSL enabled for the front end, so we can't turn that on right now. We'll look at enabling SSL later on. Advanced mode unlocks advanced features, and if we click on Learn More, we'll open details of that in another tab. And it says, as part of the Home Assistant 1.0 effort, we're simplifying the default user interface. Doing this by hiding certain configuration options like the Customize panel behind a new Advanced mode toggle. You can find this toggle on your profile page, and it's only available to admin users and is a per user setting. Enabling it for yourself won't enable it for all other admins. Let's pop back over here, and we're going to turn on advanced mode because we're going to need that later on when we explore the dashboard. And we've got automatically close connection. So should we close the connection to the server after being hidden for 5 minutes? And we can turn that on or off. I might turn that off for now. And we can also log out, change our password, set up multi-factor authentication if we like. And by default, it's got TOTP, which should be compatible with things like Google Authenticator. And then there's things like refresh tokens and long-lived access tokens. So now that we've taken a look at that, that's everything except for the configuration item. So let's take a look at configuration. Right away, it says in this view, it is possible to configure your components and Home Assistant. Not everything is possible to configure from the UI yet, but we're working on it. We'll take a look and just kind of explain what each of these does. So Home Assistant Cloud, we'll explore that more in another video, but you can add cloud connectivity to Home Assistant. This is a paid service founded by the founders of Home Assistant. There's integrations, and we spoke about integrations both in the last video and briefly before. If we look at integrations, we can see that we've got discovered integrations available that we could turn on. And we've got this integration that's already set up, the Norwegian Meteorological Institute. So, for example, if I wanted to add an integration here, we would click on the orange circle in the bottom right corner and say I wanted to add, let's go for HomeKit. HomeKit's something that you might want to add in the case that you want your Siri to interact with Home Assistant. Set that, we've got auto start turned on, and we're going to click submit. And as soon as the hash bridge is ready, pairing will be available in notifications as a HomeKit bridge setup. And we can change the area of that to, we'll call that living room for now. So we'll click finish, and then in a little while we should be able to use that to pair HomeKit. And we'll actually talk about pairing to HomeKit in another video. So we've got the integrations there, and you'll see we've got devices, entities, and areas listed here. If we click back on the configuration tab, you'll see that we've got integrations, devices, entities, and areas are kind of in this, I'm not sure if you can see the group there. So if I click on devices, you'll see we can click on integrations, devices, entities, and areas. So we can, if we wanted to, just work our way through using these tabs. Now that we've clicked on devices, you'll see that we've got the hash bridge listed here. The devices tend to be different devices we can use for tracking presence. And so when we start adding things like mobile phones, etc., you'll start seeing those appear in your devices tab, and also we'll add other device trackers, things like network integrations, things that can talk to your home network controllers. So maybe your modem router has an integration already so that it can tell when your mobile phone connects to the network and those kinds of things. But we'll talk about device tracking in a later video. If we click on the entities tab, we'll see now that we've got a list of all of the current entities that we are aware of in Home Assistant. And we can click on entities and we can see things like settings and related. And we can also, we can tick boxes and do things like remove, enable, or disable those entities. If we click on areas up in the top tab, we'll see that we have different areas available. So we've got things like bedroom, kitchen, living room. Areas can just be thought of as rooms. So for example, we can add another area and we can call it office. So we will click create and we've now got office in there. And we've also got a list of the devices that are in each of those areas. We'll click back on the configuration tab and we've got the next section. We've got automations, scenes, scripts, and helpers. If we click on automations, we'll see that we've got nothing available here. We're going to go in depth with automations a little bit later on. We'll probably do that in video 4. If we click on add an automation, we've got a kind of helper that's going to try and automate the creation of that. I've not successfully used that yet, but we'll take a look at that in the automations video. So we'll click skip for now, and then we've got this process to create a new automation. So we would give it a name, we can give it a description, our trigger mode, which we will take a look at in the automations video, we would select that. And then we've got different triggers. So you remember in the last video, we spoke about the 3 things that an automation consists of: the triggers, the conditions, and the actions. So the trigger is what starts the process of an automation rule. A condition is an optional and will prevent further execution unless all conditions are satisfied. And the actions are what Home Assistant will do when the automation is triggered. So for now, we're not going to worry about continuing with creating that automation. We're going to click back and are you sure you want to leave? Yes. We've got scenes. Now again, we haven't set up any scenes just yet. We'll talk about scenes in possibly in the automation video or maybe in a separate video. We hit the plus button and a scene, it says the description is use your scenes to bring your home alive. It's basically just a predefined configuration of your entities. So for example, we want a specific device to be included in the scene and then set all the devices to the state that you want for the scene. We'll take a closer look at scenes in another video. Scripts, again, I feel bad for saying this every few minutes, but scripts, we'll take a look in depth at these in another video, but scripts are really about executing a sequence of actions. So very similar to automations, and you can in fact use scripts inside an automation. So we can create a script that then executes a sequence of actions. So it can be more than one action, and it can include things like delays or other logical statements within there. And there's script documentation that we'll take a look at in the scripting video a little bit later on. And the last thing in here is helpers. So we don't have any helpers yet. We'll take a look at helpers in another video. So that is the section automation, scenes, scripts, and helpers. Back to configuration, we've got Lovelace dashboards. Now Lovelace is the front end for Home Assistant. So this dashboard that we created, that we had a look at before, that is using Lovelace. And we can create multiple dashboards. So if we head back to the configuration, click Lovelace dashboards, we've got overview, and the configuration method is UI controlled, and we can open that, or we can add a second dashboard. So we'll call that test, and we won't put an icon on there just yet. And we won't actually create this just yet, but we can also put an admin only, show in sidebar, those kinds of things. One example that I have of a second dashboard is a separate dashboard for an iPad wall controller, and we'll actually look at the iPad wall controller again in another video. Again, sorry I say that so much, but we can create multiple dashboards, and different users can have a different dashboard. As you saw before, when we looked at the user configuration, we can in fact also select the default dashboard that someone is going to get when they log in using a particular device. Okay, back on configurations, our next section is persons, zones, and users. And if we click on persons, we can add different people in here. So we can add Hive, and we can add a linked user in here if we want to. So because we don't have presence detection set up yet, we can't actually select a device to use to track this particular person. But we'll take a closer look at that later on. Zones, we spoke about when we were looking at the map, and we even set up another zone. If we wanted to, we could continue setting up more zones, and they're again used for presence detection. And then we've got users. So if we wanted to set up additional users on Home Assistant, we could do that here, and we can either make them administrators or not. So that's persons, zones, and users. And we've got our next section is general, server controls, logs, and info. So we will take a look at that. So general, this is similar to what we saw at the very beginning when we set the system up. So if we wanted to do things like change our time zone or our elevation or our system, our unit system from metric to freedom, or even change our location, we could make those changes and save them, or even change the name. Those changes can be made, and there's also information about our internal and external URLs, which we won't change because that could be disastrous. Server controls really kind of does what it says. It allows us to do some control of the server. Things like validate your configuration. If you've recently made some changes to the configuration and want to make sure that it's all valid. Pretty much when we look at the file editor process, we will run this check configuration every single time we modify a file, before then either restarting Home Assistant or reloading the individual configurations. So most of the time when you change part of the core configuration, you would need to restart the Home Assistant core application. But in some cases, you've got some different configurations that you can reload without having to restart the whole Home Assistant core. If we click on the logs tab here, we can see we've got some log here, and we can either clear or refresh that. And we can also load the full Home Assistant log, so we can see all of the logs in there. If we click on the info tab, this is where we can see info about our server. So we're currently running Home Assistant 114.4, a path to the configuration.yaml, which is /config on the Raspberry Pi. And we can also see links to developed by a bunch of awesome people. So if we open that tab, we've got the credits page. And that's all of the people who have worked on Home Assistant. So if you know anyone in that list, buy them a coffee. We've got things like licensing information, the source code. So if we were to look at the server source or the front end source, it actually takes us to a GitHub page where we can take a look at the source code. As I said in the previous video, being open source software, you can dig around in the code and even make customizations if you wanted to. We've also got details of what it was built using Python 3, Polymer, Icons by Google, and materialdesignicons.com. We've got system health, so the architecture that it's on, which is ARM architecture 64, embedded chassis, whether it's on a dev environment or not, all sorts of information here. Some stats about Lovelace. As we scroll down, we've also got some documentation on different integrations that are available, and if we scroll through, you'll see that there are tons already available. So things like the zone integration, the updater integration, text-to-speech is available, the Sun integration, and we can actually look at the documentation. So for example, if we wanted to look at the mobile app documentation, we can click on that and it takes us to that page. Last thing on our configuration is customizations, and that allows us to customize entities. So if we click this drop down and we want to take a look at our East Melbourne zone, we've got our latitude and longitude. We can actually modify different things in here. So for example, if we wanted to modify the icon, we could change this to marker, and it's changed the icon there. We can also add things like pictures and those kinds of things. The documentation shows us a lot more information about the details we can change for particular entities, and that is customizing. And that's pretty much the configuration section of Home Assistant. As I say, we will dig a lot deeper into some of those items in a later video. That's all we have for this video. I hope that helped you out with the user interface of Home Assistant. In the next video, we're going to take a look at the process to choose accessories to configure with your home automation system and help you out with making some decisions on that. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please like, and please also consider hitting that subscribe button in the bottom right hand corner and click the bell notification icon to make sure that you get alerts whenever I update with new content. Thanks again. I'm Stu from Hive Mind Automation, and thanks for watching.